Okay, it's at the top of the hour, so we're going to get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to anyone joining us today. My name is Alan Dominguez, and on behalf of the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar titled Insights from New Zealand Adoption of IDDSI, presented by Anna Miles and Liz Beaglehole. I would like to begin by thanking our very generous sponsors who allow the work of IDDSI to continue around the world. And before we get started, I just want to go through some quick housekeeping. We do not offer CEUs, but anyone attending this live session will automatically receive an email with a certificate of attendance and handouts that have been generously provided by our panelists. The webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our IDDSI YouTube channel in a couple days. And we do not offer certificates for people watching the recording. Your camera and your microphone as attendee will be off for the duration of the session, and the panelists will not hear or see you. But you can use the Q&A button on your menu bar to submit any questions that you have throughout the presentation. And we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation when we will have about 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions. That is all for housekeeping. So moving on to our panelists for the session, Dr. Anna Miles is a registered speech pathologist and an expert advisor on adult dysphagia, and Liz Beaglehole is a registered dietitian. Both Anna and Liz led the adoption of IDDSI in New Zealand. And also joining us on this call is Peter Lamb, the co-chair of the IDDSI Board of Directors. We are so thrilled to have Anna and Liz with us today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you to get your presentation started. Welcome, Liz and Anna. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, my name's Anna Miles, and thank you for inviting us to present the process of IDDSI implementation in New Zealand. It's a pleasure for both of us to be with you today. We're presenting the New Zealand IDDSI implementation story so far on behalf of our associations, and we will be presenting between the two of us, so we will jump between myself and Liz Beaglehole, who is a registered dietitian who I've worked with throughout this process. So New Zealand were early adopters of IDDSI, and in 2017 we concentrated on awareness and early preparation, and as we moved into 2018 we transitioned into adopt with full adoption 31st of December 2018. So today we're going to describe our implementation initiatives that we used in New Zealand and explore the challenges and successes of implementation. Before we start, we thought it probably was useful to set the scene of the perspective of the extent of the challenge of adopting in New Zealand. Adopting in New Zealand is not quite the same scale as adopting in some of your countries. We have a total of nearly 5 million people all told across the two New Zealand main islands, and the majority of them live in urban areas. We have a total of 40 hospitals to work across the country, 35,000 residents in aged care, 28 special schools, and nearly 1,000 speech pathologists and dietitians. We only have 2 specialist food companies and a handful of other companies who provide thickener powders. So we're looking at probably the same sort of implementation perhaps as some of your cities or regions rather than whole country adoption, which of course has advantages. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you. Hello to everybody. So in New Zealand, in terms of the groups of people we have requiring texture modified diets, we have mostly groups clustered into public hospitals, long-term care facilities, aged care and community living people as well. For our public hospitals, and as Anna said, we have only 40, most of those are run by a contracted food service provider, with a few offering in-house, so it's run by the government in-house. In long-term care facilities, these are usually run in-house, And for aged care, again, they have clusters of companies that may have, say, up to 20 rest homes across New Zealand. And again, we might have around 8 to 10 of those companies which cover most of the aged care facilities we have in New Zealand. For community living people, support in terms of IDDSI implementation has mostly come through speech language therapists and dietitians. And we do also have, as Anna said, providers of texture modified food, which the community can purchase, and also this food has been used by public hospitals, aged care facilities, and the long-term care facilities as well. If we look at the history of our standardisation, this is our history of texture modified diet terminology in New Zealand has matched that of Australia. In 2007, New Zealand adopted the Australasian texture modified diet standards. And you can see in this slide the differences between our old terminology and IDDSI. The label names remain the same with the adjustment to the numbering system and the colours. We removed the level 150 and the 400s. But you can see even in 2007, the terms of honey and nectar were removed back then as well. Slightly thick was a new standard that did not exist in New Zealand previously. Similarly, for our foods, the labels are very similar. There was the new addition of the numbers and colours for the food labels, as well as for the thickened liquids. And there is the new liquidised level in IDDSI that overlaps in the zone of levels 3 and 4. Transitional foods was also new for us. That hadn't been part of the Australasian standards. So you can see that we did already have minced and moist and puree, but we only had soft. And the soft and bite-sized level is very different to what we used to have as texture A soft. And again, even in 2007, our standards had no words of moolie, but still today in New Zealand, we probably still have people using the word moolie for puree. When we first adopted IDDSI, the later edition of regular easy to chew was not present. And this did come about following feedback, including from New Zealand, that the soft and bite size was very restrictive and the jump between the level soft and bite size and level 7 was too great. Probably in practice, our previous soft and our soft was similar to the easy to chew.
Thanks, Liz. Well, let's have a look at what we did. Let's have a look at our implementation plan. A lot of effort and time went into awareness and prepare in New Zealand in 2017. We had a small group of New Zealand speech language therapists and dietitians who worked together to establish a wider network across all sectors who were involved in food for people with dysphagia. And this group met regularly for 2 years. This group created a consultation meeting of sectors, invited them, and then that group became a larger cross-industry working group who worked together through to full implementation. And I think Liz and I would both agree that one of the greatest outcomes of this work has been that greater awareness and greater collaboration and interaction between health professionals and industry that we really did not have to the same level before. And that's been an incredible opportunity for us. Considerable effort went into the communication with dietitians and speech pathologists to act as advocates and mentors. They were encouraged to take a stand in regular newsletters, and taking a stand included supporting your own food service, teaching others, advocating for safety, never using only old terminology, and documenting using new terminology. And this was communicated to the speech pathologists and dietitians regularly throughout the first few years.
However, we cannot say that there were no challenges. And in all honesty, the challenges continue today, 3 years on. And we've learned that adoption is certainly not the end, and that working on improving texture-modified diets for people with dysphagia will always be on the agenda. The Australian standards were 10 years old, and there were gaps and inaccuracies in those. And while we found some people welcomed and accepted the change, we did strike others that were resistant to change and did view this as quite a hassle to their process, and did question perhaps why we needed to be doing this. So in terms of dietitians in food services in New Zealand, there's a small group of dietitians who work in food service. So many of us were at the initial introductory meeting. Acceptance of IDDSI within this group varied, with some of our lead dietitians questioning the evidence or the need to change. So that's a reality of people questioning IDDSI. However, once we sort of introduced IDDSI and informed these dietitians, they were able then to take IDDSI back to their sites. And so for some dietitians working in organisations who, say, operate around 20 rest homes, and they use a national menu, they were able to change the menu pretty quickly in order to incorporate IDDSI. And again, in public hospitals where we would have a dietitian working in the food service, able to change the menu relatively simply, and again, across a number of hospitals quite quickly. As a dietitian, once you understand IDDSI, you can plan options quite well and relatively easily. It is, of course, the implementation that does make it difficult. The challenges also come from education and terminology. And as people do tend to use the older terms, even the terms prior to 2007. And of course, the preparation of food is a new learning tool for lots of people, specifically around soft and bite size. And there does remain differences in interpretations sometimes that dietitians need to work through as well. One example might be gravy. I sort of strike people who wonder if they need to thicken gravy for everybody or not. So there's still lots of learning to be done, even at the adopt phase. And I've put up here that the soft and bite-sized diet was probably one of the bigger challenges. We had the term soft used for many years, and of course using soft and bite-sized sounds different, but we do know that they're very different in textures. So firstly, the challenge was to have people understand the difference and then not use the term soft when the requirement was for easy to chew, or to mean soft and bite-sized when that was what was recommended. And for us, in terms of foods, the most common awareness that we needed to change with people were that soft sandwiches or cut-up sausages or even sliced roast meats and gravy were no longer suitable for somebody on a soft and bite-sized diet. And those foods we might have offered for someone on a soft diet, but it's very different now. Easy to chew was introduced, and that probably helped in terms of menu planning, but still there remains some confusion as to when to use these. And I did have some facilities that didn't like using the words easy to chew. They sort of commented that all of their food is easy to chew. So it was still the pushback in terms of using the terminology. And then in practical terms, in a large-scale kitchen, actually providing bite-size requirements is a challenge. Who will do it? In many settings with external mass production food service providers, unskilled kitchen staff are following strict step-by-step guidelines and didn't have the authority or the capacity to be cutting specific foods into the right size in the kitchen. And some foods don't really lend themselves to be cut because it affects the presentation. And in terms of timings and flow in a food service, it is hard to sort of stop production and start cutting up food. There is the option that you could cut it as you serve it to the resident or the patient and just before you serve it, But again, that depends on who has the authority to do those steps. And for some of our contractors who were providing food in public hospitals, they felt that that was a risk, that they didn't want food to be leaving the kitchen, not in the correct soft and bite size, only for someone else to take responsibility to cut it up. And so there does need to be a clear decision around what to do for soft and bite size. And the other part with that is that people may then drop down levels. And so for soft and bite size may in fact find, to mitigate the risk, that they offer minced and moist or puree. With the puree diets, we found in practice many situations where care staff were modifying diets in non-standard ways. So people's interpretation of how the puree should be was different in different sites. And sometimes people, we find, particularly in, say, aged care, are put on a puree diet not necessarily related to dysphagia, but because the nurse has assessed them as perhaps having difficulty eating the meal or consuming sufficient intakes. So people were put on puree diets not necessarily related to dysphagia. And then that can be confusing if they're perhaps okay to have regular snacks in between their meals. So that poses a challenge of making that very clear to nursing staff, kitchen staff and caregivers. If someone's on a dysphagia diet and they require puree, then all their food should be pureed. But if they've been identified as sometimes needing sort of puree, the main meal, due to fatigue issues, for example, but they're okay to have a soft muffin, then then the kitchen staff find that a little bit confusing. And we in New Zealand, not all residents put on a puree diet have been assessed by speech language pathologists. So we're still working in that area as well. And we probably have a bit of an overuse, so with that, of puree diets and also thickened fluids in New Zealand. So we're still, with this introduction of IDDSI, there still remains the opportunity for education around appropriate use of puree diets and thickened fluids. The other thing with puree is that we always used to teach, and I think you can see in the slides there, that all puree needed to be served with gravy. So the concept of, if you've prepared the puree effectively as recommended by IDDSI, then you don't need to add the extra gravy for the moistness. And that's quite a change in practice for many of our food services. It's also taken, sorry, Anna, it's also taken a bit of work for people to understand that you can use the different levels. Say if somebody's on a level 5, then you can use from 0 to 5 and offer different options on the plate, rather than just everything needing to be served at a minced and moist level. So with this slide, implementation at sites, this is really the process that I've tended to follow as a consulting dietitian to a variety of aged care and long-term care facilities. So I have influence on writing the menu, and then of course that requires education of staff. What I do know is implementation process takes a long time, and it's probably never done. You will find yourself saying the same things a lot over and over and just reinforcing the message. So first of all, initially I aim to achieve an awareness of IDDSI for people to start using the correct terms and to stop using the non-IDDSI terms. So stopping mooly, stopping softs and those kind of words. Then a good understanding of the testing methods, so that people themselves have the ability to ask their own questions and answer them. Is this a minced and moist suitable food? Does this meet soft and bite size? So food service staff have probably been used to having lists of foods of what's suitable and what's not suitable, and to sort of break that habit and enable them to answer those own questions themselves is really the beauty of IDDSI, but it does take a lot of work to let them work that out for themselves. So we need a lot of education around that, and to give the staff preparing the food the confidence that they are doing it correctly. And the tests are very simple. It's lovely to be able to just grab a fork and show someone very easily how to test that their food is correct. Then once you've sort of done the education phase, then planning the menu for texture modified diets. And I've sort of got a bit of an example there for all of the textures that are required in the facility. And I would say that we can't get chefs to do this at this stage, because it is a new concept, and I think you really do need educated dietitians that know IDDSI to be planning texture modified diets on the menu. You can work with chefs, I think, then with regards to recipes and presentation ideas, but in terms of the menu planning, I think that really does need to be done by the dietitian. And then in terms of once that's in place, then you can use the auditing tools to review what is actually happening in practice, and just to keep reviewing the meals, people's use of terminology, just ongoing in the long process. So first of all, aim for increase in awareness, then the menu, and then preparation.
So alongside all of the incredible work of people like Liz in the field, we've had a number of research initiatives to try and support implementation. Early work described current practice to really give us an understanding of where we were at and what we needed to do. We found that around a third of residents in residential care were on some type of texture modified diet, whether that be puree, minced, moist, or soft and bite-sized. And while all residential care facilities were offering a puree diet, the percentage that were offering a minced and moist and a soft and bite-sized was much less. We found, interestingly, that the portion sizes of the meals were not fully compliant with standards in New Zealand across all the diet types, especially with regards to protein and carbohydrate. And this has led to a more global approach to our implementation, where we're really trying to look at nutrition as well as texture modified diet safety at the same time. And interestingly, a lot of our diets were not compliant. While the puree had the greatest amount of compliance with IDDSI testing, the minced and moist and the soft and bite-sized at this early stage during our preparation stages certainly wasn't at IDDSI standard yet. This moved into some more recent work that we've done, trying to look at how to implement IDDSI in a more sophisticated way. And this work is ongoing, but some of it should be published very soon. It was just presented at the Dysphagia Research Society this year. We took a large amount of data collection points, and we used the consolidated framework of implementation research to map the facilitators and barriers to implementation, so that we could conduct a gap analysis and provide implementation approaches that were individual for each facility. We found that across the 5 facilities that we tested, that the staff were very keen. They were very, very keen to learn about IDDSI, and they certainly felt that it so the attitudes towards IDDSI were great. However, the meals were not IDDSI compliant. Again, there were no labeling of IDDSI meal types seen around the kitchens or the dining rooms. And while staff were aware of IDDSI, less than 50% felt that they'd had sufficient learning opportunities and had sufficient resources. They were tested on their knowledge, and the knowledge that they had was extraordinarily poor. This was in contrast to their facility managers, who said that IDDSI was easy to implement, it was hugely successful, and that everybody had adopted it. So, so this was quite interesting to us. The managers felt they'd done the right thing, and were certainly, again, pro IDDSI, but there were breakdowns in the knowledge of staff on the shop floor. We identified a number of significant barriers across the 4 facilities. The first being about the use of materials and the delivery of materials. They had not printed off all of the IDDSI materials and were using a more ad hoc sort of process to providing education to the kitchens. The sites that were missing opinion leaders certainly did worse in terms of IDDSI implementation, and the sites with champions did much better. So there was a clear sign there that you need someone to lead this on site. Many of the staff felt that they had not had any time to talk about IDDSI, that it wasn't coming up in their team meetings, and they certainly weren't auditing menus using IDDSI. There was a quite clear trend towards a lack of professional input, and this is a barrier to the New Zealand system, that a residential care facility must pay and bring in a speech pathologist or a dietitian, and therefore tend to do it when something goes wrong in a more reactive way, when a patient is sick, and have not engaged in dietitians and speech therapists so much for audit support and training in the same that would help with IDDSI implementation. There were plenty of facilitators that we could use for our implementation plan. Certainly those who had printed off the IDDSI resources thought they were fabulous, and that they were going to improve patient care, and that there were sufficient online resources to use should they need them. As I said, those with a dedicated project manager had greater outcomes than those who didn't. They all felt that there was a real opportunity for multidisciplinary collaboration, and working at an organization level from top down, so that if their top tier management told them to do this and paid for the right speech pathologists and dietitians to be on site to support it, then things would go well. Many of them talked about the role of commercial companies. Many of our commercial companies work very closely with speech pathologists and dietitians and employ them, and in so have over time provided education at the same time as advertising their wares, and this had been well received by care facilities.
We have
success for us now. Sorry.
Thanks, Anna. So we have, with all the challenges, we have of course had great successes too. And so we thought we'd share some of the greatest ones with you. So we were fortunate to gain the support from our food producers or food manufacturers who changed their labelling to reflect IDDSI. This was a big success and did not come without considerable work. Changing the labels came with a lot of cost for these food manufacturers, and we're certainly very grateful for their belief in our ultimate goal of patient safety as we negotiated timelines to support their businesses. So we did aim for the end 31 December 2018, and so that was quite a challenge for these food manufacturers to rechange their labelling and coding. So we had to sort of compromise there. One of our largest food distributors, so they will purchase meats in from butchers and then distribute it through to some of our hospitals, agreed to add the particle size of their products to their website to help food service providers for products so that they could meet the soft and bite size. If they wanted a dice, they could meet that soft and bite size by directly buying from Bidfood. Other strategies that have led to our success, including keeping up the regular stakeholder consultation meetings, keeping regular newsletters where those who had made changes were named and added to a regularly circulated list of IDDSI compliant workplaces and companies, and an allocation of speech language pathologists and dietitian champions to support companies which helped us gain significant buy-in from these food service providers. So the mixture of support, engagement and peer pressure certainly helped. So today, all products in New Zealand have IDDSI labelling and are clearly labelled on their websites. All food products introduce and using IDDSI as they advertise and promote their products across the country. And as Anna said right at the beginning, we only have, sort of 2 providers, or 2 manufacturers. So again, it's relatively simple, but a very powerful way of implementing IDDSI. Food service providers were supported by dietitians and speech pathologists to audit and change their menus. We had a great success with the endorsement of adding IDDSI into our Health, Quality and Safety Commission website, which acknowledged dysphagia as a risk and encouraged the implementation of IDDSI, which was a powerful sort of policy change. In New Zealand, dietitians audit aged care facilities with a standardised tool that we use across New Zealand, and this was modified and reviewed to incorporate the IDDSI criteria so that every dietitian auditing a food service could check the food at that point in the menu.
We used media across many forums to publicise and excite. This took a considerable amount of our time and effort, including national radio, health professionals and food service newsletters, aged care facility newsletters. And the working group gained enough credibility and awareness that they were invited to speak at multiple cross-industry conferences as keynote speakers. And we had conferences not just in health, but also in speech pathology and dietetics, but also in aged care health, in food science, and food technology. So we really did get a broad sweep of attention. I think probably this is the thing that Liz and I are most proud of right now, because it's something that's quite new. We really focused, we were very concerned that the people who feed residents in aged care particularly are a very transient population of workforce, and they're an unskilled population of workforce. And I'm sure this is the same in many of your countries. Their English competence and health literacy is often quite poor. So we were very concerned that they may not be quite the right fit for us for our greatest attention for education. So we put a lot more education into our chefs. Our chefs tend to be a little bit more stable, particularly the head chef in a kitchen. And we had this theory that if the food that came out was right, then actually we probably were going to be all right. So we trialed an e-learning chef training program with one of our aged care facility providers, so one company that had multiple sites. This is one of our largest aged care providers, so it gave us plenty of positive but also constructive feedback about the way forward. So we at that point put in an application to the New Zealand Qualification of Authority for approval for a micro credential in IDDSI. Now this is a formalized, this is what all of our degrees come under, the NZQA. So this is a formalized course with university points and is respected at a national level. The micro credential has been written primarily by Liz and I with the support of an additional speech pathologist and the team at Service IQ. And we've created an interactive e-learning training program that will be launched next month. Once the chefs have been through the formal online modules, they're tested in their workplace for IDDSI competence and signed off as certified. And the goal long term is that we would have at least one chef in every facility who is certified to provide menus for people who have dysphagia. So a huge step forward for us in New Zealand.
So in conclusion, IDDSI has been a vehicle for a huge amount more than simply the standardization of texture modified diets. I imagine most of the participants today have been on a journey with texture modified diets, and we have come a long way from perhaps pureeing everything together. And this just continues the improvement and the advocacy for our patients that do require texture modified diets. And it's really brought out into the spotlight the risks, but also how it can actually be done effectively and safely. And I know in New Zealand, it's quite a competitive market really across facilities, particularly private aged care facilities, to demonstrate their their forward thinking and their well-presented texture modified diet meals. So, which for me, being in food service for the past 20 years is just wonderful to see the attention that texture modified diets do get now. Success is most definitely a multi-pronged affair, and it does take considerable effort and considerable buy-in from multiple stakeholders in the industry. From policy, from administrators to management, through to the chefs, through to the nurses, through to caregivers, through to everybody. And of course, our food manufacturers. Without correct labelling and kitchen menu planning, old habits will be very difficult to shift. And all documentation needs to match. So the clinical notes need to match what goes in the food services to what goes on the patient care plan. There will always be a need for ongoing education in these settings due to quick staff turnover. And so sustainable education modules like the one that Anna and I are working on are worth considering. It's important that the communication and relationships are strong between dietitians, speech pathologists, and industry and everybody involved, so that the message is clear and consistent and we all move forward together. If every speech pathologist and dietitian believe in IDDSI, then everyone will believe. So that's the conclusion of our talk. We are very happy to answer any questions and welcome discussion and offer our support.
Thank you so much to Liz and Anna for sharing your journey of IDDSI implementation with us. I don't want to jump into the, in case someone has questions already, but congratulations on the e-learning training course. That's amazing. So well done. If you have questions and if you're joining us today, you can just submit them using the Q&A button on your menu bar. And while we wait for folks to submit some questions, I have a couple already here for both of our panelists. So let's get started. For those who are assembling an implementation team, would you mind providing some tips on how to best engage the participation of a multidisciplinary team?
Yeah, I think we talked about some of the things we did in our implementation that certainly worked. And I think this early engagement before you start to make changes is really important. So we brought in geriatricians to do some of the research with us, and that got us into some of the geriatric conferences. We brought in food industry and the food service providers, and that brought us opportunity to talk to their conferences. So I think that early engagement and relationship building, hey, this is what's out there, how are we going to do it together, is the key. like every relationship, if you go in with the answer and a mandate to change, you get less positive outcomes than if you go in and ask people to play with you and come up with it together. So I certainly think the holding back on enforcement and using it as a vehicle for collaboration and working together has been hugely successful for us.
If I just add, perhaps on a more individual site level, you know, if you're forming a team across a facility or across a group of facilities, like Anna says, that the sort of describing the why is very powerful. And I know IDDSI have a very powerful slide that lists all of the, well, just a whole slide of different ages, different diets, and choking incidents. And that is really, really powerful to present at the beginning, because then people do suddenly realize this is real and this is why we're looking at this. And so I think, you know, that's a nice starting point. And then people can, you know, come in from their different perspectives, but we're all going for that one goal. We don't want our residents' names up on that slide.
Mm-hmm.
Good point, Liz.
Great, thank you. Moving on, Nyanka is asking, when you want to implement IDDSI in a hospital, do you think you should do a pilot in one department of the hospital or all departments at the same time?
That's a good question. And we did take a sort of, we gave people a year to adopt and really encouraged them not to feel they have to be perfect before they adopted. So we encouraged them to slowly build up momentum, but most hospitals found that from a food service perspective, it was better to do it across the whole hospital, to change the labels, to change the computerized coding, and to do all that in one go. So I think education might be able to be done at one place at a time, but actually when you're talking about a food service that comes from a central kitchen, you know, it's going to be hard to do that without doing the whole hospital at the same time.
I think what you might want to do is perhaps introduce each diet separately. So maybe you really focus on getting your puree absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And then, you know, and then you can move on to the different, that's probably what I would recommend. Yeah.
And we certainly had that, didn't we, Liz? Many of the food providers had so many challenges with the soft and bite-sized as in terms of amount of change needed, that we said, okay, we'll just adopt IDDSI, adopt the labels, adopt the processes, get your puree and mince moist perfect, and take soft and bite-sized off your list of things you provide. So if you do not allow anything on the menu that is labeled wrong, but if you don't provide that because you don't have it, then let's work on that slowly. But it's more important that you don't have things on the menu that are incorrectly labeled as a soft and bite-sized when they're not.
Thank you. Melissa is asking if you used a computerized menu management system like Seaboard, for example, and if you did, what are some of the barriers and solutions to implement IDDSI within these systems?
I haven't used Seaboard, so I can't comment on that. Maybe someone else has?
We don't have
What have you done?
But a lot of our hospitals are computerized menu programmed. I think, as we said at the beginning, the word labels didn't change dramatically for us. So we didn't have a huge amount of change to be made to the computerized system. The bigger challenge was what was behind it. So we couldn't just convert the one that was called soft to soft and bite-sized, because those meals under that label were not soft and bite-sized. They were in fact regular. So it was the computer was easy, what was behind it and how it was coded for each meal and part of a meal was the challenging point. So it really, in every place, it took a full rework of every single item on every menu. So we had to sit down with every soft peaches pot, every mousse, every meat, and it all had to be tested before we could recode the computerized system.
Great, thank you very much. Moving on, this is a question for Liz. You mentioned that it took a long time for implementation. How long did it take your facility to actually transition? And did you just set a go live date and just aimed for that?
Well, I've sort of introduced IDDSI to a number of sites, but I might think of one that's probably in, and how long would that have taken? They were pretty quick at doing it, maybe 6 months. But yeah, and I absolutely wouldn't say that we're all finished there now either. But they were very motivated, and they had a chef running the facility, so very capable. They purchased in the prepared puree meals already, so lots of things enabled them to sort of implement IDDSI quite well, from me coming in to educate all the staff, to me changing the menus, to the chef, creating the puree options. They probably didn't have many minced and moist, and then modifying what their main option was to make it fit for soft and bite size was the way they did it. But yeah, it's ongoing. It's not, you don't start and then I say off 18 months later it's all done and dusted and we can walk away. It really, really just keeps going.
Yeah, we certainly gave people the challenge of 12 months to adopt, having already had 12 months to prepare. And some people really did take that full 12 months of testing, menu testing and recoding and deciding what they had and didn't have enough of. And other facilities, particularly smaller ones, so we found more of the in-house catering, or our adult disability sector and our specialist school sector found things a lot easier. They had a much easier job of transition, whereas the people that took the longest were the very large food service companies that just had a much bigger job to achieve, and a much more fiscal challenge of they really had a lot of problems with nothing could cost more money, which made things much added another complexity to the situation.
That brings up another interesting question. Did you ever encounter people saying our current system is working and why should we switch over to IDDSI?
We did, didn't we, Liz?
That's right, because it is a total culture change. I always talk about instead of pureeing the main, why don't we make what's suitable? So not just pureeing all food, but only preparing foods that are suitable, and that goes for all of the other textures as well. So that is the mindset, because of course there's times when you cannot puree or modify the main option. So you have to make something new, and that is a cost, and that is in terms of labour and food. But I think you just basically, I feel like you weren't really providing a suitable option in the first place. And so now we are looking at what is suitable, and so it definitely you do get pushback, but you want to highlight the issues, of course. If a rest home's having scrambled eggs with bacon and toast, and then I say, well, what are you giving the people on a puree diet? That opens up very quickly where the gaps are, and that just saying, oh, pureed scrambled eggs, that's why we need the menu planning done. Yeah.
I think that really comes back to our overall reflections on IDDSI and implementation, that much of what we were doing was improving food for people with dysphagia, not implementing IDDSI, not changing names and labels and colors. It was a much wider process. And I think we found that discussion had more push and power to it than just, well, because internationally we've been told to change the label, so telling people to change a label didn't work, but telling people, but look at the problems we have now, like Liz has described. There were plenty of problems with food service already, and there probably will be plenty of problems again, but everybody is in the industry because they care about people. So we found that, well, let's just see how it, let's just improve processes was a better option than, well, let's just do what we're told.
Mm-hmm. And did this discussion about safety, was this similar to the discussion that you had with people in the administration? Because you quickly mentioned touched on this earlier, they're often focused on finance and they're worried about the additional costs. So was this a similar conversation that you had to have with them?
We didn't actually, Liz and I spent quite a bit of time with CEOs we have some very big players in the aged care setting who own a large number of sites. And the CEO level was not a challenge. They are in a business where they're out to make money, and they could see quite clearly that that this was somewhere they could actually look good. They could advertise this, they could promote this option. There'd been a really big change in New Zealand in the last 10 years to make aged care look like you're on holiday. They have a cafe style dining room where you can pick what you want and you sit around in nice tables and chairs that look a bit more like you're eating in a cafe. And that's great when people come with their elderly parent to look around, but they were really aware that there are many people, and actually most people don't go to aged care till they have a significant level of disability in New Zealand. There are a lot of people that's not what they were looking for when they came to visit a site. They wanted reassurance of safety, reassurance that their loved one would be looked after despite their complex needs. And they saw this as a great promotion opportunity, and we're putting it in their newsletters. Hey, we've got safe diets that have been tested by a resident dietitian, and it was giving them the opportunity to really push, we're early adopters of this. This is really important for us. Yeah, so there's a way of fighting it for anyone.
Great, thank you for that discussion. I wonder if we can move on to a bit of a quick round of questions just before we finish our session. Let's see, for Anna, what if sites do not have regular access to a speech pathologist? How may you suggest leadership or education for IDDSI?
This has been a big problem in New Zealand, and I'm not sure where the person who asked the question lives and works. In New Zealand, there's a mandate in our policy document that they must have their menu checked by a dietitian. So many sites have a better dietitian input than speech therapy input. And the speech therapist is a paid, someone they have to pay to come in, which we were not finding was happening in all sites. So I do think that that's a problem. And I think this is when we need to come back to trusting interdisciplinary practice and trusting in our relationships with dietitians, who is on site, and our relationships with nurses, who is on site that has the means and knowledge to advocate and champion. And if there isn't a speech pathologist, how do we get them to do some of the work a speech pathologist would do? Certainly, obviously not the testing of individual patients, dysphagia, but the more advocacy, education-based work, and perhaps getting them to champion bringing the speech pathologist in more often. We certainly encouraged every speech therapist who was attending a reactive assessment of a resident with dysphagia to always take with them IDDSI documentation and use that as an opportunity to educate an IDDSI while you were on site. But I know in America, the speech pathologists are often on site in these homes, and you've got a better service that makes it much easier. But yeah, it's not the same around the world.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears a bit, and I'm going to focus on a couple of questions on food producers. How important was engagement with food producers during the implementation, and what more can they do to support the sustainability of IDDSI in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think Liz and I commented on that we would not have got where we got if we had not persuaded and got the beautiful engagement with our food producers to go along with this. They were quite clear how much it cost them to change labeling, and that was a major hurdle for them, and many of them changed their websites before they were able to actually change the labeling of their products, and did it in a sort of a staged process. I think it's vital that we can't change names of anything if the product in front of you is still glaringly saying honey or 150. So without that, I think we're stuffed. You know, we have to find a way to get them on side with us, and believe in them. And we really did believe in them, that their primary role, as well as making money, is the safety of people with dysphagia. And so, yeah, I think working with them, not telling them what to do, was definitely a strength of the process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I am going to move on to our last couple questions. Nyanka is asking, when you give advice, do you say drinks and foods apart, or do you say, for example, IDDSI 2 to IDDSI 5?
Liz, how's it coded at your hospital?
It's for the patients, they will list both, but they say it in the words. So they'll say puree, mildly thickened fluids. That's how we get it in our acute hospital here. Usually, yeah, I think that would be generally the practice, wouldn't it? Is to specify that one level, and yeah, and then the fluid. So say the food, and then say the drinks. Yeah.
I think you're right, though. It's a good question, because we hit at that issue that people was taking that black and white and weren't necessarily seeing that it was a span of, that they can have anything between 2 and 5. And I think that's just a traditional way that speech pathologists have prescribed, that we prescribe a food and we prescribe a drink. And it hasn't been until we tried to implement IDDSI that we realized what that means. When you give someone a 2-tiered triangle, you're actually just giving people 2 points on it, not saying, so that means they can have puree and they can have thick smoothies, all the way down to mildly thick. So I think that is a challenge to us as speech pathologists, to think about whether we're doing that the right way, or whether we're adding to the confusion.
Okay. I have a couple of last questions for Anna. Would it be possible for chefs from other countries to take the e-learning chef training course?
I'm not sure, but I can certainly find out about that. Okay. It might be that they'd be able to take the pay for the online aspect, but obviously our national accreditors who will be doing the on-site competency testing may not be possible, obviously. So it might be that they need to find somebody in their own country, or just take the educational content aspect. that's certainly something we could look at in the future once it's launched.
Great. Okay, and for the last question, I'm going to invite Peter Lamb to the call just to answer this question from Alistair that says, I understand there's some interest in using the SonoMed CT system of clinical terminology to add coded terms for IDDSI, and do you see a prospect in this?
Alan, thank you very much for that question. Alistair, your timing is immaculate. Back in 2019, late 2019, IDDSI was already in discussion with SNOMED International and SNOMED CT. Several of the member countries for SNOMED had already started to propose mapping over the terminology from IDDSI and having incorporated into SNOMED CT. This is a process, just like Anna and Liz had described how IDDSI implementation is a process. There definitely is a possibility and a prospect in this. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, if you weren't aware, from the United States recently announced that going forward, October 31st, 2021 forward, they will no longer support their old national dysphagia diet terminology, but will only support the terminology from the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative. So there is a real prompt at the moment to try to get the IDDSI terminology even into the nutrition care process terminology. So the only thing we can say to you at this point is, Alistair, stand by. And if you are somebody who is well familiar with SNOMED CT and has some expertise in that area, we do invite perhaps your help. So please contact us through our website and let us know, whoever that's on this call, any experience you've got with SNOMED CT and working with SNOMED CT, we invite your participation. IDDSI has been an effort that's been built by a global community. May I just take this opportunity to now say the warmest or coolest thank you, depending on the weather there in New Zealand, Liz and Anna. And we wish you the best in the continuation of fostering the use of IDDSI in New Zealand. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, hard work, and wisdom with us. We really, really appreciate the fantastic webinar today. So on behalf of IDDSI, we thank everybody who's here. Alan, I'll pass it over to you for some final words.
Thanks, Peter. We are now at the top of the hour, so that marks the end of our session today. Just echoing Peter, thank you so much to Anna and Liz for spending your morning with us and sharing your journey of IDDSI implementation and answering all those good questions. If people want to get in touch with IDDSI, you can do that via our website, IDDSI.org. And if you want to find the latest and official documentation on IDDSI, you can visit IDDSI.org/resources that I am putting in the, I will put it in the chat in a few moments. But that's about it. Thank you very much. We hope you have a lovely weekend, and thank you for joining us today, the listeners, and thank you so much, Liz and Anna, again. And until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.